With that, I'm going to introduce David. I first got to see David share his product wisdom and some of his great experiences on this front on the storytelling side back when I took the Berkeley Haas product management program back in 2017. And if you don't know David, David's a really fantastic person. He's got a ton to share here today. He's the Amazon best-selling author of the book, Get Your Startup Story Straight, which provides a definitive storytelling framework for innovators and entrepreneurs. He's helped all kinds of innovators and all kinds of product teams and groups and companies use storytelling to put their products and businesses on the map. David is on the professional faculty at Berkeley Haas School of Business. He coaches founders in several Bay Area accelerators. And prior to his career, he's done a million different things. He's been the president of an ad agency. He held senior marketing roles at 2 tech startups, and he was also the VP of marketing at Yahoo way back in its day. And when he's not working, which I don't know where he finds the time, he's also produces theater and was also recently the chair of the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. So with that, I'm going to pass over to David to get things started, and let's go from there.
It's great to be with you all. It's only after years and years of working with people just like you and founders of startups, product leads and founders of startups that I put together the thinkings and teachings that I teach and that are ultimately in the book. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a sort of a high-level primer on my core themes about storytelling, and then we'll take the Q&A. So let's just get right into it. So that's the book, Get Your Startup Story Straight. You're going to hear from a bunch of founders and product leads talking about their products as we go. But let's just dive right into it. You can't tell a good story if you don't have a good story to tell. The number one rule of storytelling. You got to start with a good story. You have to architect a really great story. The people at Pixar are experts at this. They're product people, and their product is a story. The thing that comes out the other end of their assembly line is a story. Their films are stories, and they take about 5 years on average to make these films. But believe it or not, 4 of those 5 years, 80% of the time, they're just working on story. They're working on the narrative. Who's the movie about? Who's the protagonist? What do they want? What's their intention? What's their motivation? What's the conflict in the story that's keeping them from getting what they want? How does it resolve? What are some of the subplots? So a small group of people spend 4 years working on that. And then in the last year, they bring on hundreds of people who animate the film and do the lighting and the sound and the score, and the celebrity voices are all mixed beautifully together and post-produced. But 80% of the time they're working on the narrative, because you have to start with that great story. So I'm going to show a trailer for this film. To start, I want you to start thinking about story elements, and just think about who's the protagonist in this little story, what does this person want, and what's the conflict that's standing in their way.
It's you. You're gonna get me in trouble, Dante. Someone could hear me. I wish someone wanted to hear me. Other than you. Okay. I know I'm not supposed to love music.
No music. No music.
But my great-grandma Coco's father was the greatest musician of all time. Papa. Ernesto de la Cruz. One day, he left with his guitar and never returned. No, my family thinks music is a curse. Great-great-grandfather, none of them understand me. I'm supposed to play music.
All right, who's in there?
I'm sorry. What's going on? I'm just dreaming. Ah!
Do you mind?
What?
All right, so there's our little tale. So obvious, the protagonist is the boy, right? It's the movie's about him. And more than anything, what he wants is to play music. But he also wants the love of his family. And right now he has to choose, and this is a terrible dilemma for him. And the reason he can't play music is that there's this family curse, supposedly, that his grandma is telling him about, because his great-great-grandfather had gone away as a musician, never returned. The family was destitute for a generation or two without the breadwinner. And so now no music in this family. So that sets up the premise for a story. A great story piques our curiosity. We want to know what's going to happen. Is this kid going to get to play music at some point and still have the love of his family and be able to be with his family? And he has to go on this hero's journey to the land of the dead to find out what really happened with his ancestors and bring that information back to see if he can get what he wants. You have to watch the movie to find out what really happens. But let's compare that to what we're all in the business of, which is creating innovation narratives, product stories. And these stories are just as much a story as the story in a film. There's another film I'm going to show you a scene from in a second, The Social Network, which I bet many of you have seen, which is overall about the creation of Facebook. But there's a scene in the film which really tells the product story. And as I show you this scene now, I want you to think about the same three things I asked you to think about with the trailer. Who's the protagonist in the product story? Who's the customer? Who's Mark building the product for? What do they want? What's their intention? And what's standing in their way? What's their conflict?
Mark, there is a girl in your art history class. Her name is Stephanie Addis. Do you happen to know if she's a boyfriend? Have you ever seen her with anyone? And if not, do you happen to know if she's looking to go out with anyone?
People don't walk around with a sign on them that says them.
Mark?
So what does Mark do? He runs back across the quad. It's snowing out. He's wearing shorts and flip-flops, of course, because he's Mark. And he runs back to his room. And he'd already coded most of the product, but he hadn't pushed it live yet. And what does he do? Well, he added relationship status. And that is the product story arc. So let's deconstruct it. So the protagonist in this story, in the film, it's Mark Zuckerberg. But in the product story, the protagonist is this guy. It's Dustin. He's literally building the product for his classmates. And if this, we don't know if this scene actually happened in real life, it's a movie, but if it happened or something like this happened, you could argue it's the greatest customer interview in history because of what it's ultimately launched. But he discovered in this moment that Dustin, his intention was to ask somebody out, and he needed this information. So the functional need was to have more information about his peer group, particularly whether or not Stephanie Addis was single. But there was this emotional driver, and every great product story should have an emotional driver as well. And in this case, Mark was, his friend Dustin was like, he was nervous and he didn't have the confidence and he was afraid of rejection. And Zuckerberg could sense all of that. And it's not like if he knew she was single, she'd automatically go out with him, but he'd feel a little bit better about it, a little bit less likely to be rejected. Hey, I have a chance here. And Zuckerberg knew he could solve that because he'd already built the network. All he had to do was add the feature of relationship status. That's a product story, just like the other story. There's a strong parallel. So why do we do this story thing? Why is our story so important to us as product leaders and innovators? Well, when we tell a story, something different happens inside our brain. We actually activate a part of the brain that we don't activate when we just deliver facts and figures to somebody, like in a PowerPoint presentation. We activate the insula, the emotional region. And what that does is it puts us in these stories. We literally hear ourselves in a story. There's this a mirror neuron effect in our brains where our brains activate the same senses when we hear about an experience as if we're literally having it ourselves. We're also up to 22 times more likely to remember the information we heard if we learn about it through the lens of a narrative, according to Jerome Bruner, who's a cognitive psychologist. It's extraordinary because the emotional region and the memory centers of the brain are linked. And dopamine is released when we hear, when emotions are activated, and that lights up our memory centers. So it's like, we can't help this. Our brains work this way. It's an incredibly powerful thing, and it's an incredibly powerful tool for someone who's trying to get their audience to empathize with the customer. And according to Uri Hassan, who's a Princeton professor, a story is the only way to activate parts in the brain so that the listener, your audience, turns the story into their own idea and experience. And why does that matter for you? Well, if you're trying to get somebody to go along and get behind the invention that you're creating, the new product, the new feature, the new service you're creating, then What you want is you want them to feel for the customer that you're doing this for and really understand what they're struggling with, so they're rooting for you to solve that problem. And stories can do that. So there's 3 parts to the book. The first part is about story building, finding your narrative. The second part's about telling the story. The third part is about story archetypes. I'm not going to cover the third part today, but I am going to talk about the first 2 parts. So story building. How do we architect the story? How do we do what Pixar does in those first 4 years? Well, I always find it's helpful just to watch these narratives and just be able to identify these components. So I'm going to share with you a short video that was created by Square Capital, and one of their co-founders, Jack Dorsey, also the co-founder of Twitter, is a huge believer in storytelling. In fact, there's a great talk he gives where he says they write these user narratives. He said they read like a play. They like to write these things out. So not only do we get to know the specific issue the customer is dealing with, that we're going to help them with our invention, with our solution, but we're going to understand in general what they're up to and what's going on with them, so we have more context. So watch this short video about Square Capital and see how they introduce the protagonists. We get to know them. We get to know what they're about. We then learn about their specific issue, and then Square will talk about how they solve it.
We hear about success stories all the time, and they kind of tear at your heartstrings. There are so many stories that you hear of people living the total American dream.
Having my own business has set my soul on fire. It's made me realize that I can achieve anything that I want to do. It doesn't matter where you came from.
I graduated from art school in 2009. I couldn't really find a job, and I just wanted to work in the dark realm.
When I lost my job, I had this vision that I would have a mobile flower truck. When I realized that this was something I was really passionate about, everything started happening really quickly.
If you've ever been a business and you've gone to look for funding, you have to fill out hundreds of pieces of paper in all of the typical loan documents.
I did try to get a loan the traditional way by going to the bank, but they required so much of what I didn't have being a new business. It just made it really difficult to get that financial help. That's when I was introduced to Square Capital.
What sets Square apart is that we have a deep relationship and understanding with our sellers. And we ask the questions, can we be more proactive? Can we help a seller buy a new salon chair or hire a new employee? And that led us to an answer of Square Capital.
About a year ago, I was running some reports on Square and just had a little window pop up.
So I got this email from Square announcing this new program, Square Capital.
That mentioned something about Square Capital, and I was like, what's this?
What is this? This is nice.
What? You're basically offering me money at a fixed rate.
You click on Capital in your dashboard.
They said, here's the amount that we approve you for. The money was in my account 24 hours later. That was it. It was easy as that.
It was kind of magic.
We've been working with businesses of every type, of every size. The beauty of Square and Square Capital together is that we're helping to empower a business that has been underserved by the financial industry.
The process of growing from a closet in a basement to a complex has been really incredible, and having the Square Capital funding has made a huge difference.
As soon as I got the funds, I decided to freshen up the truck a little bit. It was just nice to give her a little spa day.
And each of the other entrepreneurs then talk about what they did with their resources. So let's just talk about the structure of this. Again, if we compare it to the film, in the film we have our protagonist, Miguel, the boy. He has this intention of playing music, but still being around his family. There's this central conflict concerning the family curse, and then there's some outcome, some resolution to the story. Hopefully he gets to, play music and be around his crew. So let's compare that to this innovation narrative, this product story. We have a customer, that is the protagonist. In this case, they're small businesses. And our stories are always better when we have a specific customer in mind. The more specific the segment, the easier it is for your audience as you're telling the story about what you're doing to picture who you're building it for. So this isn't just any business. These tend to be smaller businesses. And then we have these insights about what it's like. Not only do we learn about their specific issues around money, But we learn about why they got into the business, and this is a passion. It's something they've always wanted to do. They dreamed of having a flower truck, for example. But then we learn about the specific issues around money. They can't get loans. It's really hard. They have to do a lot of paperwork. In most cases, the doors are blocked, the doors closed, and that's the central problem. They can't get money through the traditional avenues in the financial institutions. So Square Capital comes along, and what do? And I always like to say, if you can define what you do with 3 points, it's easier for people to remember and recall what it is you've actually created. So what do? Well, they pre-approve the loan because they already know what your cash flow is, because your system is operating on Square Capital. They give it to you in 24 hours, and it's a fixed rate loan. Boom, boom, boom. We all now know how Square Capital works, and we understand that story. Simple story, setup, payoff, it all hangs together. So what I created to try and help innovators work on these stories is what I call the innovation narrative storyboard. Scott, when you took the class that at Berkeley where we met, I introduced this, and you filled it out, and helped you and helps anyone sort of think through the specific aspects of the story. So I'm going to walk through this storyboard, which has all these different components, by telling you the story of Pranoti Nagarkar. Pranoti is an inventor from Singapore, was originally from India, and she was having this sort of observation about people just like her and her husband. They were both working. They were non-resident Indian professionals, NRI professionals, so they were living outside of India by definition. Both parents working. Quality of life is great. They're making a lot of money, better healthcare, better education for the kids, all good. But her observation was about she and her peers, and about NRIs all over the world, is that they were feeling guilty about not passing their culture on to their children in the same way they experienced it growing up. And food was a really big part of that. Food really matters. And she said, when I was growing up, I'd be in the kitchen. My mom would be teaching me how to bake the breads and cook the meals and talking about the history of our people and our family. And I'm working all day, so I don't have the time to do that. And it's not like she could solve that problem in entirety, but with that as a backdrop, those sort of understanding of what her community was going through, she decided to attack a specific problem, and that was the roti problem. So what's the roti problem? Well, rotis are round flat bread made in many Indian communities. And it takes a while to make rotis. And she said, by the way, there's 2.3 billion rotis eaten every single day around the world, every day. So her question was, how can we make healthy rotis quickly so we can put this wonderful central part of an Indian meal right back into the center of her family and have her kids experience them the same way she did growing up? Because she didn't have the time. It might take 30 to 45 minutes to make these rotis otherwise. So what's then the benefit of that? If she can get that done, if she can solve that problem, the benefit for the customer is to be able to connect with their culture and enjoy fresh rotis in minutes. I always say, for the value proposition, just complete the sentence, now I can. Now I can what? Now I can connect with my culture and enjoy fresh rotis in minutes. And what did she do? Well, she built a Rotimatic robot, which has a particle dispenser that shoots in flour and water at just the right amount to make the dough. It has a custom heat flow to heat that roti as if it was being heated in the traditional manner. And it uses AI, and it's connected to the internet. So over time, it can optimize your roti based on your tastes and others' tastes to get sort of that perfect roti that's right for you. And what are the alternatives? How is this solution different and better than what's out there? Well, the alternatives are to spend hours in the kitchen, to order takeout, and to get frozen rotis. And by all accounts, none of those are very palatable solutions. You're either spending too much time or it's just not very good. And what's interesting about this story is that, and all great product stories have this emotional and functional need that's being addressed. The functional need, of course, I need these little flatbreads pretty quickly. The emotional need is I want to have that cultural connection. I want my child to get up in the morning and smell that roti, and have that roti, and we could talk about it and have some of the same sensations that she had when she was growing up. So she won third place in this global competition that I was judging about 10 years ago when I met her. And she went on, she sold 70,000 Rotimatics since, after finalizing the product, at over $1,000. I think they sell for $1,500 now. The point is, it was only because that she was meeting both a functional and emotional need that she had such a great product success, and that the story is so compelling. So that's the first part that we talk about. How do we build and structure that story so we can make sure when it's time to share the story, we've got all the elements in place. But when we have that structure, how can we then lift the story? How can we bring emotion to it, make it more evocative? And that's the second part, which is how do we tell a compelling story once we've structured it? And one way is to get personal. There's a story about Serbi Sarna who wouldn't tell the story I'm about to show her telling you because she thought it was too personal and not appropriate. It's only after a venture capitalist pushed her to find out why she was working on the area of biotech she was working on that she finally shared the story. And now she shares it with everyone. Here's Serbi Sarna's story about Envision Medical.
So I was 13 years old, writing a paper about Emerson in my bedroom, when all of a sudden I felt such a sharp pang of pain in my side that I could hardly find my mom and say, "My side hurts," before blacking out. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. I didn't know it then, but it was going to be the first of many trips. You see, they could say that I had a complex ovarian cyst, but what they couldn't tell me is whether or not that cyst was cancerous without doing risky, invasive surgeries that could have rendered me infertile or risk spreading the cancer to other parts of the body. So began my journey to become a patient to an impatient entrepreneur in hopes that other mothers and daughters didn't have to go through what we did and make the very difficult choices that we did at the time. So from that seeds was born Envision Medical. And really, the dream was to bring focus to women's health, starting by tackling the greatest unmet need impacting women today, and that is developing a tool for early stage ovarian cancer detection.
So she starts telling this story, and Tim Draper says to her, this venture capitalist, "Oh my God, you have to tell this story every time, because I now, it's, first of all, it's emotional. I won't forget it. I'm rooting for you. I know how hard you want to, how committed you are to solving the problem, and I know how well you understand it." So it was incredible change in her direction. He became her first big investor. He gave her $4 million to get started on really catalyzing her business, and she ultimately sold it for $250 million. It's an incredible story. She's even written a book about her experience now. So she went from not wanting to talk about all this stuff to now sharing much more broadly. And hopefully you noticed when she gave that talk, there was a little catch in her voice when she was talking about her mother. And even though she's probably given this talk now 100 times, it's still emotional for her to talk about what she and her mom went through together. And you feel that as an audience. And unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, you have that empathy, and it gives you that deeper connection to what she's doing. Another thing that's important, so get personal. That's one tool. If you have that arrow in your quiver, use it. Another thing to think about is, how do I grab people from the get-go? How do I hook an audience right from the beginning and get them to lock in? There's a reason Bond films start with a chase scene. It's to get you to focus and get agitated. Oh my God, what's going on? And you're in the movie. Likewise, how do you grab people right away? There's a wonderful little talk that Thibaut Duchemin gave when he was launching his product, Ava. At the time, it was called Transcends. I'll show you this little video. He refers to it Transcends. It's now Ava. But he's raised quite a bit of money for his company, telling a really powerful story, and he just grabs you right from the beginning.
So first up, an amazing team transcends. Imagine a world in which group conversations include people who cannot hear. Thibaut Duchemin of Transcends.
Hi, everybody. My name is Thibaut. I'm the founder and CEO of Transcends. Transcends makes group conversation between the deaf and the hearing people possible. I was born in a deaf family. My parents are deaf. My sister is deaf. I understand how painful it is to try to understand group conversations when you can't hear well. You're so focused on reading the lips of the person in front of you when somebody else starts speaking. So you turn the head and you miss the first words. But because you miss those words, you miss the whole conversation again and again and again. But that was not only my family. There's 400 million people out there that suffer from disabling hearing loss.
So what a wonderful, we call it a vertical takeoff for his story. He starts by saying, I grew up in a deaf family. My parents are deaf. My sister is deaf. I mean, he's got you right from the beginning. You want to know about his family. You want to know what was that experience like. And then very quickly, he describes the problem. I'm looking over here. Someone over there says something. By the time I get over there, it's too late, even if I read lips. And then he quantifies, he says 450 million people have this problem. So in just a moment, he's pulled you in, he's introduced the problem, he's told you the magnitude of it, and off you go. And you want to hear more about how he solves it. So that's the power of a hook, of grabbing people right from the beginning. There's also the origin story. And sometimes the origin story includes backstory. Sometimes the origin story includes the inciting incident, like what's the event that got you to want to explore something or to pursue a certain solution to some problem. Donnell Baird of Block Power has raised $100 million for his solution, which is to try and convert buildings from fossil fuels to electric energy. And it's 30 to 40% of the carbon footprint in this country comes from buildings, heating and powering buildings. So it's a huge problem. And he has this wonderful little origin story talking about his life as a child, and a more recent story talking about his work on the Obama campaign and an experience that he had that set him on this path. So listen to this story. This is an audio story.
So my parents emigrated from Guyana. And my dad was an engineer and my mom was a teacher, and the country's economy was collapsing. And so they moved to the United States into a pretty tough neighborhood in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, which is where Notorious B.I.G. is from. And at the time in the early 80s, most of the buildings didn't have working heating systems. So in the winter, we and all of our neighbors, when it got super cold outside, we would open up the windows and we would turn on the oven in the kitchen and open up the oven door and use the oven to provide heat to all of our apartments all winter. And you got to remember to open up the window so the carbon monoxide can flow out of the apartment. So that's how we did it. You know, I ended up going to like 8 or 9 states with the Obama presidential campaign. And there's a pattern that I saw as we would head into low income and working communities. There's this persistent pattern where there's just this tremendous waste of energy and neglected low and moderate income buildings that really reminded me of where I grew up. I remember walking around outside one day, and it was 20 degrees outside, and I was looking at this giant apartment building with all the windows open, and I was like, that's just like my 3-story apartment building where I grew up. They're heating this giant apartment building with their ovens. And so there is an inefficiency in the energy system that I saw not only in Brooklyn, but in Cleveland and in Charlotte, on the South Carolina-Georgia border, and the Obama campaign that led me to believe that this was a persistent pattern of energy neglect or energy poverty that needed to be addressed.
And then he goes on to talk about how he went on to solve it, which we don't have time to talk about here. You can read about Block Power online. I wrote a story recently about this company on Forbes.com, if this is a story you want to learn more about. So anyway, so tell that story. I think, and one of the things he did, he did a really nice job of talking about that moment and having that visual of seeing those buildings. What a powerful visual, 20 degrees out and all these buildings have the windows open. We're in there with him. We're walking through that street with him, and that vision of that image lands on us as an audience, and we're right there with him as he has that experience. Okay, one more illustration, and I think then we'll probably flip it over to Q&A. I call this romancing the problem. Hugely important thing. If I don't care about the thing that you're working on, if I don't think it's much of an issue for the customer you're talking about, I'm not going to care about your solution. I'm not going to be invested in hearing you solve it. But if you really romance this problem and you really help me understand, this is a big deal, at least for a certain kind of person, the customer I'm serving, this is a really big deal, then I'm going to be rooting for you to solve it and bring that solution in as the heroic answer to whatever the person is struggling with. And Shanlin is a founder of a company called Zola Wedding Registry Site. Some of you may be aware of it if you're in that demo where you've been to weddings recently or have one yourself. She worked for me as an intern at Yahoo many years ago, and then went on to build this great company. He's raised $100 million, is doing fantastic. But she talks about how her and her founder, Nobu, left their prior company, the Gilt Group, and decided to start a company together. And they were debating what to do, and they had 3 ideas, and they landed on this, their 3rd idea. And she tells this story, which I call the tiny teaspoon of doom story, where she came up with a very compelling way of romancing the problem. So let's listen to this. This is another audio story.
So the 3rd idea was in the wedding space, and that is what then became the idea for Zola. Around that time, 2013 was the year that all my friends got married at exactly the same time, and I was going to a wedding every single weekend. And I think we all have this year in our lives. I remember I was complaining to Nobu about one of my friends' wedding registries, and she had registered for silver forks and spoons and knives, and the only thing that I could afford on her wedding registry was one tiny teaspoon.
Totally acceptable. Totally fine. I'm getting you this spoon.
I wanted to get her something special that reflected our close friendship, that reflected her passions, and this was not her at all. And so I was so upset that I called her and I said, "What is up with your registry?" And she said, "Oh, it was such a pain to register at all these different stores. I couldn't handle it anymore. So I just told my mother she could do whatever she wanted. And I don't even know what's on my registry right now."
Yeah.
So I was complaining to Nobu about how painful this was. And he's married. And so he said, "Oh, you think it's bad as a guest. It was just as bad from my point of view when Ange, his wife, and Nobu were getting married. They got into huge fights about their wedding registry and every part of their wedding planning process." And he was complaining about how he had to use 20 different apps and products and services to plan that one day that they nearly got a divorce before they were even married.
So there's the story. It's just a wonderful story, and think about her expressiveness in telling the story. And it was so horrible, and I just gave it to my mother. You can really feel that frustration. And talking about Nobu almost getting the divorce. So both sides, the person creating the site and the person using the site, were frustrated. Here it is, the most important day in her friend's life. One of her closest friends, and all she can get her is this lousy teaspoon because it was such an impersonal wedding registry. And even though there were many wedding registry solutions online when she launched this business in 2013, she was able to convince investors and others and partners and ultimately customers that there was a much better way, and they built this incredible business. So that's the power. What is your tiny teaspoon of doom story for your product or service that can illustrate the frustration of the customer so you could then go solve it?
So
all right. The final thought before we go to Q&A is that when you have a great story, everyone wants to tell it. And that's your goal as a storyteller, to get people to remember your story, to be compelled by your story, and to really understand it so that they could share it with somebody else. And because when that happens, that's when great things happen with what we're working on. So that's our goal as a storyteller. And if you want to get the book, you can go on my website and check it out if you want more on this, or we'll put up I'm sure by the end, we'll put up a link to the Amazon page if you want to buy it through Amazon. So that's my little taste of the book, the third section of the book. So those were the first two sections. The third section's about archetypes. In doing this work for now 15 years, I've come across a whole bunch of product story archetypes, from the love story, which is a two-sided market story, to the promised land story, and a whole bunch of others. And I talk about those in the third section, but don't have time this morning to get into all of that. So let's go to Q&A and take some of your questions if you have any.
Yeah, definitely. Encourage people to get over, utilize Q&A. We'll definitely moderate those and bring those in. Maybe just as we're waiting for some people to ask their questions or the things that they're interested in learning about, I'm going to shoot you a few, David.
Great.
So I think the first one here, is like, I'm going to put myself in the product team kind of ecosystem. And so typically a product team, as maybe Marty Kagan defines, it's going to have a designer, an engineer, product manager, that kind of typical trio triad that we kind of often hear about. But a product team also can have lots of other people that are sort of part of that. And I think maybe as product people, maybe we're a little unsure about who should be telling or kind of owning the creation of the story in that context. Do you have some maybe things, wisdom you could share on that side about how best to approach, that challenge and problem?
Well, in my experience, the best stories are developed by the collective. Not necessarily the writing of or telling of the story, but coming up with a foundation, that building out the storyboard. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that everybody is feeding in the insights that they have, and that you're ultimately focusing on what the story is. There may be a designer who thinks the customer is this segment, and you know, and the head of engineering thinks, well, that's really the segment we should. And maybe they haven't even talked to each other, and they're building the product for different people, right? That's happened. That does happen, right? So one of the things that Dorsey talks about in his talk about storytelling, Jack Dorsey, is he says we use this tool to get everybody aligned, to get everybody on the same page, we want the same movie playing for everybody about who we're serving and how we're serving them and what their issues are. And whenever I do go into a company and help them create the story, I get all the players on that team together, and we go through the storyboard together. We have debates and discussions. No, it's this segment. No, it's this segment. No, I had this insight. Well, that's true, but I think this is the deeper insight. Let's go for that one. Oh, we haven't come up with an emotional insight. Oh, I have one. And then collectively you fill out that storyboard. So I think that's the role for the team. Maybe then someone goes off from there and figures out how to tell it. And you don't want that to necessarily be a Frankenstein thing, but you want everybody's input on what the story is.
Yeah, no, that's really great point. Maybe the first question here, I see one from Kevin that came in through the chat. What are some common mistakes that people make when storytelling, and how can you avoid them?
Well, the most common mistake is when someone asks you what you do, you say, well, let me tell you about what I built. And they start by talking about the product. Whenever anybody does that with me, I say, stop, don't do that. Because your product is the hero in the story. It's going to come in and save the day. Well, how can I interest in or even understand your product and what it does, unless I understand who needs it, first of all? So that instinct is to talk about the thing, and maybe you give someone some high level just framework so they know what category this is in. We're coming up with something to make it easier for people to get around town, and it's going to transform cities by making it easier for people to get around town. But now let me tell you about Sam. And Sam lives in this part of town, and then we start telling the story. I need to get to know the protagonist in the story, what they're struggling with, before you tell me this great solution you've created. So that's one problem. They just go right to the product. Another problem sometimes is that people give you a very high level sense of the problem, and then they solve it, and they start solving specific aspects of the problem without introducing them up front. So using that same example, you might say, global warming is a huge issue, and I'm going to attack global warming. And then they start telling you what they've done, but they haven't gone into the specific issue of local mobility. I mean, in my head, I'm thinking of something like Lime scooters. But here's why getting around town is hard. And then you go through specific issues that have to do with some of the alternatives, taking the subway or walking or taking your own bicycle or the public, the bus or whatever. And you start to detail some of those things. Get to that specificity in your setup so that when you get to the payoff, you describe how the solution works. You've got this wonderful parallel structure. You've set up these issues someone's struggling with, and then you solve for them. And the best innovation stories do a good job of giving you specific problems in the setup, and then you solve for them in the solution.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of examples.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good. Jumping to another question here. Someone's struggling to tell a compelling story as their company's a data analytics platform in the ad tech space. Wow, I think that would actually be super compelling, but nothing pulls essentially at the heartstrings. We've been trying to frame it that we are helping the actual users that our customers do their job as better or easier. Is this compelling enough, or should we dig deeper in some way?
Dig deeper. There's a wonderful commercial I show in my classes to demonstrate the dig deeper, where a young boy goes into a DMV. I don't know if I showed you this one, Scott, but he goes into the DMV and he says to the woman behind the counter, who's got this very stoic face, I'm here for a driver's license. And she says, what do you really want? And he says, I want to be able to get out and, drive around on my own. Well, what do you really want? Well, I want to show my independence to my parents. They need me. They need, me more than I need them. And then she says, what do you really want? He says, I want Reese's Puffs. And she says, okay. And she gives him Reese's Puffs. It's a silly little commercial, but the fact is, by drilling down and keep pressing, she got to this emotional thing that was really behind why he wanted the driver's license. And likewise, I'll give you an example of a company I worked with that's in the data space. It's called Databricks. Some of you may know about it. Big giant company based in Berkeley. A couple of PhDs started it with a professor about 8 years ago. And I was helping them develop the story, and we discovered this really interesting thing about data scientists at the time, who was their the people who need their solution, which helps you manage and manipulate data in these giant data lakes. And what we discovered is that companies were investing a fortune in housing data. They were hiring data scientists, and they were saying, okay, data scientist, you're gonna save the company. You're the superhero that's gonna save the company. You're gonna go into that data, you're gonna find these great business insights, you're gonna tell me what they are, and we're gonna crush the competition. Go. And these massive expectations, you're gonna save the company, and they go back to their desks, and they couldn't do anything, at least in terms of finding those insights, because they were spending all their time finding an engineer to write a program, writing programs themselves, operating the programs, and they had no time to actually dig for the insights. And that gap, that expectation gap, was the emotional part of the story. The functional part of the story is, I'm not going to go through here, but a bunch of things about accessing those giant data platforms in the cloud that were difficult to do, that Databricks was making it much easier to operate in. But anyway, the point is, every story, B2B, B2C, doesn't matter, there is some emotional component to the story. People get as worked up about their business life as they do with the consumer products they use. And it's your job, whoever wrote that question, to go in and keep asking, what do you really want? What's behind that? What's really bugging you, to understand maybe the emotional side of the story.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Another one here, I guess kicked off with, thanks for sharing such amazing stories, David. I believe storytelling can be during any phase, but what is an ideal way to tell stories when you work during the discovery phase of a product?
Well, I think if you acknowledge that your story is a hypothesis, any good innovation process is it's a cycle. We're constantly, in reinventing what our idea is. And if we're open to that, and we recognize we're gonna start with a story, but as we go out and talk to people, that story may evolve, and that's okay. We can't be married, and we can't fall in love with our first story. One of my favorite examples of this was a guy building a product that his initial idea, his name was Ben. Ben wanted to build something, and Maya was his partner. They wanted to build something for small businesses that was like a Yelp for small businesses. So they went out, that was their premise. You're running a bakery, you want to get a business card, you go around and look at printers, and this service would help you tell you which printer to use. That was the idea. So they go out and they start talking to bakeries and dry cleaners and all these small little local businesses. And not startups, but little small local businesses. And they're asking, what's it like doing this? And all they could talk about was hiring. We hate hiring. Well, what do you hate about hiring? Craigslist is the only thing we can use, and it's terrible. What's terrible about it? Oh, and then they start to go into all the things they hated about Craigslist, and they hated Craigslist. So they went back to their desks and were like, well, that story we had about helping these people find that's not the story. And their story evolved. Same customer, but the problem they decided to solve was, how do we help them with the local hiring? How do we make it more seamless? How do we find people in a way that's much more organic? It doesn't have these really clunky things that were created 100 years ago. And that's what they did. And they have a business called Local Wise, and they're all over the country, in markets all over the country. The point is, they started with a hypothesis. They were open to evolving the hypothesis, and they did so and made a ton of progress, built a nice business.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm going to shoot in with another one. We wait for maybe a couple other questions to show up. But really kind of curious, like in particular, the creative ways in which you've seen these stories told. I know we've seen things of maybe sketches or videos. The Jack Dorsey example you showed obviously is a fairly high profile, highly produced kind of video piece.
Right.
But essentially, how can they best tell those stories? And in particular, I'm thinking a lot about teams today. We're all working across sometimes multiple time zones. We're delivering these stories, unfortunately, sometimes not in person, or able to deliver them in person. We have to deliver them in an async way. So what are some of the creative ways that you've kind of seen those storytelling happen, and how best maybe can they approach those challenges?
Well, I think if we're on video, we should, we can use an image if we want to sort of give people a sense of the story, or we just work on theater of the mind. I purposely showed a couple of examples, gave you a couple of examples that were audio examples. So you're walking with Danelle Baird down the street, you have to think about, okay, how do I bring to life walking through Cleveland in a 20-degree weather and seeing this giant apartment building with all the windows open? I want you to have that experience. Just last night, one of my closest friends runs the National Institute for Health, NIH, Brain Initiative, which is this massive initiative, a $500 million budget, to basically document all the elements in the brain. They haven't really, come up with a map for every single thing that's operating the brain, and that's what they're doing. And their goal is to dramatically advance solutions to brain health, especially neurological disorders. And my friend John said, so just the other day, he said, because we talk about storytelling all the time, he said, I was talking to the congressional aides because I got to get funding from the government, from the Congress. And he said, before I get into specifically what we're doing, I want to tell you a story. And he tells a story of actually being at my son's wedding and sitting next to an old friend who he hadn't seen for like 15 years, who was an artist and was the mother of a daughter who was the same age as our children. All our kids grew up together. And he's telling her what she's doing. She asked about what he's doing. He said she locked in on my eyes, and she kept looking at me and saying, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about the neurological issues that you can address. And he saw that she was really interested. She says, it's really personal for me. And he looked down in her lap. He saw that she was holding her hand to keep it from the tremor, from vibrating. And he realized that she had Parkinson's. And he didn't know that until that moment. And then by the end of the conversation, she told him. But that's the story he told to the Congress. To the congressional representatives. And I just told you that story here. He told me last night, there was no pictures. I didn't show you a picture of Deborah. I didn't show a picture of my friend John, but I told you a story. And probably when I got to the eyes locking and the hand tremor, you felt that. I know I felt it. I mean, I know all the players, but any person hearing that story, that's kind of an emotional story. And he says, what we're doing is we're accelerating solutions for those people. We're going to come up with the answers for that, but the time is ticking. The clock is ticking. And if you don't invest in us, people like Deborah are not going to get what she needs before it's too late. And that was an incredible, powerful story. And it's just a story well told. And there were a couple of really important parts of the story: the locking of the eyes, the looking down in the lap. That's what you'll remember. And what you have to think about as a storyteller is, like, I may not land on that the first time I tell the story. Right? It may be the third time I tell the story that I land on those two things or one of those things. But when I see my audience responding and having an emotional reaction, I've got to use that thing. So it's an iterative process. You're constantly looking to try and improve and lift these stories.
Yeah, and practice makes perfect to a large degree.
Practice makes perfect. And every time you tell the story, it should get a little bit better.
Yep. And I know a big part of this we talk about often in product is the need to tell that story repeatedly. That we just telling it once isn't enough. We need to tell it over and over and over and over. So eventually it kind of sticks in people's minds and in people's heads. So key part of our job as product people is probably getting out of our chairs and just being intentional about telling that story more than repeatedly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. One last question, maybe before we finish things up today, is it's sometimes difficult to find out who the protagonist is in the story. Is it the end user? Is it the buyer? Is it somebody else? If we have multiple protagonists, potentially, do we create one for each and create separate stories for each, or do we essentially just kind of bubble that down into a global story for the end customer?
Yeah, it's a great question, very common question. And there's no right answer, but I always like people, the guidepost that I give you is who's in the most pain, and who's really struggling with the issue. And if it's sort of a tie, just pick one and maybe play with both stories. I'll give you one or two examples. So there's a woman who is creating something called Identical, a solution for a drill-free dental implant. And when we talked about it at the accelerator where we were working, I said, hey, why don't you think about who's in the most pain? She said, well, it's the end user, it's the patient, it's not the dentist, even though she sells the solution to the dentist. And she said, I'm going to go with that and tell the story of what it's like, to get your teeth drilled. And so she started her presentation by playing the sound of a dental drill. And the audience goes, well, that's awful. But she puts you in the shoes or in the chair of being that person who's getting your tooth drilled. She can, after telling that story, she can talk about the benefits for the dentist. There's a place in the story for it, but she told that through the lens of the protagonist, of the patient. I'll give you a B2B example. There's a solution called ShotSpotter that is a gunshot detection solution for urban areas where gunshots, where gunfire, unfortunately, is more prevalent than it should be. And there's two ways to tell the story. You can tell the story through the lens of the people in the communities who are underserved. 80% of gunshots in communities like this don't have the gunshots reported for a variety of reasons. People don't report the gunshots. So 80% of the time, the worst thing that happens in your neighborhood goes unreported. It's terrible. There's great inequality there. So you could tell their story, or because they sell the product to police chiefs. Police chiefs are having huge issues right now because of this great divide between police forces and communities, particularly Black and brown communities, where a lot of these issues tend to be prominent, or more prominent than anyone would like. And so we tell the story with ShotSpotter through the lens of the police chief. And we talk about what they're going through, trying to build community with their community. And how can you build community if you don't show up for the worst thing that happens? What trust is there if you never show up for gun violence? Now they can with the solution, because they know exactly when and where they happen 100% of the time, so they can show up for every single horrible event like this. And that we're now telling the story through the lens of the police chief. So there's different ways to do it, but start with who's in the most pain and try and tell their story, or try out a couple of different ones and see which resonates the most.
Yeah, that's awesome. Really appreciate it, David. This has been an insightful day and afternoon, morning conversation with you. So I really do appreciate everything you've been able to add to this discussion today. With that, we're going to wrap things up and close things up for the day. I have shared out a link here for everybody for our post-event survey. If you do have a moment, please take a time. I know David would love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your feedback on this event as well. And you also have a chance to win one of our monthly prizes as well on that side. So please take a moment if you can to do that. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to create a post in our community. We'd love to hear your post-event questions, dialogue, discussion on this topic. What's got you interested? What's got the challenges that you're dealing with, the problems you're having, and how can we help essentially you tell a more effective story essentially as part of your product work that you do. Lots of things and ways in which to grow your product craft within our community. So we do invite you to come and check that stuff out. And lots of different events as well coming up. We have Nils Davis next week talking about roadmaps. We have Connie Kwan coming back to talk about her 6 story type system, also exploring a little bit of the storytelling kind of model of things. We have JJ Rory coming in talking about the 5 immutable truths of great product managers. We have Daniel Merriman joining us for conversation on roadmaps and sort of the illusion of discomfort. Bruce McCarthy, the author of Roadmaps books that you've all probably read, coming back to talk about us in December. And finally closing out our December events, Pavel Samsonov talking about hypothesis-driven product development. And again, lots of opportunities to get involved here. If you're interested in being a speaker, so you got some knowledge to share with our community about your product craft and the work that you do, we'd love to hear from you. You don't have to be a famous person like David with a great book. We're always interested in everybody that has something to share on this side too on that end. So with that, thank you, David. Again, that was a really, really great session. Oh, you got something to add here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, because, shameless self-promotion, that's the book. I put the link to the Amazon place where you can buy it. You can also order it from your local bookstore, but it's in the chat now if you want to get it. And if you like it, share it with friends, post it on your LinkedIn or wherever you post social stuff, or tweet it out and tell people about it. My goal is just get in his hands as many people so they can create followings for incredible products. That's the mission I'm on, and hopefully it can be somewhat useful for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I can highly suggest it. I mean, I've got a copy here and definitely lots of value in it, and encourage you all to go out and pick up a copy. It's been a great read and a great one to keep on your shelf, especially if you one day might move from product to being a startup founder. Who knows? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Once again, thanks very much. Thanks, David.
Nice
Appreciate it.
Time with you. Cheers.
No problem. Take care.